Egypt, land of the pharaohs and of the Bible. Some of the greatest stories in the Bible were set in this ancient empire. As I continued my journey walking the Bible, I followed Joseph's path to Egypt when he was sold by his brothers into bondage.
Long before Rome, all roads led to Egypt.
In a wonderful rags-to-riches story, Joseph becomes the most powerful advisor to the Pharaoh.
He says, "No, I'm not going to tell you. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare."
My journey took me from the temple of Karnak to the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. I discovered how ancient Egyptian culture influenced the Israelites' lives and even their deaths.
So it's almost like you can draw a direct connection between these hieroglyphs on the wall and what's in this book.
The story of the Israelites in Egypt took me to the shallow waters of the Nile, where baby Moses was rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter. I searched for answers to some of the mysteries of their life under tyranny. I followed the epic-making exodus that still speaks to all oppressed people. And I explored the route the Israelites might have taken out of slavery into freedom. My journey through the Bible began in Mesopotamia. I climbed Mount Ararat in search of Noah's Ark and followed the path of Abraham. God promises Abraham that if he goes forth to the promised land, he will be rewarded with a great nation. The Bible is a living story. It is a tale of good and evil, love and hate, slavery and freedom, and above all, the worship of one God. Join me now on a 10,000-mile adventure through the greatest story ever told. The stories of the Bible seem to be set in some faraway land, in some long-ago place. In truth, they take place in a specific time and a specific place.
The biblical story begins in Mesopotamia. With Abraham, it moves to the Promised Land. And with Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, it moves to Egypt, where it stays for the next 500 years.
When Joseph's story begins in the book of Genesis, he is in the Promised Land, living with his father Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Jacob has 12 sons, whose descendants will become known as the 12 tribes of Israel.
Now Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a coat of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more.
Joseph's coat of many colors is often associated with his prophetic ability to interpret dreams. When Joseph is 17 years old, his jealous brothers plot to kill him. At the last moment, they instead sell him to traders who are passing through Canaan or Canaan en route to Egypt. come here to the desert to retrace Joseph's path to Egypt, to experience firsthand what his journey as a slave might have been like. The Bible doesn't describe the route, but caravans have been making this trip since long before Joseph's time. Scholars question whether camels had been domesticated at the time of Joseph, but certainly when the Bible was written down, they had become the chief mode of transportation on these desert trading routes. For Joseph, traveling to Egypt would have been a grueling trek through a harsh unknown. But for the Bedouin, this barren, unforgiving terrain is home. For thousands of years, they have been the unrivaled masters of desert survival, and they set up our camp with well-practiced efficiency. The story of Joseph, as with all Bible stories I was learning, revealed a relationship not only between the people and God, but also between the people and the land. Here, among the Bedouin, the story of Joseph is a part of their desert tradition, as well as their religion. Muslims consider Abraham a prophet, as well as his great-grandson, Joseph. I asked what they knew about Joseph.
God gave Joseph half of the world's beauty. He was very handsome, and his father's favorite son. His brothers were jealous of Joseph and ridiculed him for being a dreamer. When Joseph tells his brothers of a dream predicting that he will someday rule over them, the angry brothers decide to throw him into a well.
Now, once Joseph's brothers put him in the well, how does he get from there down to Egypt?
After throwing him into the well, a caravan bound for Egypt passes by. The brothers decide to sell Joseph as a slave.
The story of Joseph has elements of other biblical stories. Ancient trading routes like Abraham used, intense sibling rivalry like Ishmael and Isaac. But it also has something new. As I'm delving into the story, I'm beginning to see, to understand Joseph, you have to understand the real heart of the story. And that's not the place he came from. That's the place he's going. Egypt.
At the time Joseph arrived, Egypt was the most powerful civilization in the world. And there is no place to feel its grandeur more than Karnak Temple in ancient Thebes, now Luxor. Today, even in ruins, it would easily qualify as one of the wonders of the world. For ancient Egyptians, or a visiting Israelite, approaching what is still the largest temple complex in the world must have been an awe-inspiring act.
May the evening soothe and welcome you, O travelers from Upper Egypt.
Even to the modern Western eye, its scale is almost unimaginable. Karnak is large enough to hold at least 10 Notre Dames and 20 Parthenons. The key to Egypt's strength was the Nile, the longest river in the world. It begins in Central Africa, flows north through Ethiopia, then floods into Egypt. Nile silt was so fertile that farmers could grow 2 crops from the same land in the same year. After arriving in Egypt, Joseph would likely have found himself in a place like this, a thriving bazaar where international goods are bought and sold.
Long before Rome, all roads led to Egypt. Huge trading caravans came up from the south, east across the desert, and down from the Promised Land. Traders brought all sorts of barter: cows, sheep, goats, camels, and yes, humans.
In Genesis 39, Joseph is sold as a servant into the household of the Pharaoh's chief steward, Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce the handsome young Joseph, but Joseph refuses. She then accuses Joseph of trying to seduce her. Joseph is thrown into the Pharaoh's prison.
Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. They said to Joseph, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please."
I descended deep under the banks of the Nile to explore the role of religion and dreams in ancient Egypt. Here in this royal tomb, like the one King Tut was found in, images of Seti I's nighttime journey toward the afterlife fill the walls. I felt as if I were entering some private religious sanctuary. In death, the nighttime journey was permanent. In life, the nightly journey of sleep was temporary and filled with dreams. The Egyptians worshipped many gods, but the centerpiece of their religion was the god of the sun, Ra. It was when the sun went down that the mysteries of the dark unfolded. Priests who could interpret these nighttime messages or dreams were highly valued. While Joseph is in prison, he also becomes known as a gifted interpreter of dreams. In the shadow of the Sphinx, I met with the renowned Egyptologist, Dr. Gabi Ali Gabala, to explore the significance of dreams in Egyptian life and in the Bible. The Sphinx was built by one pharaoh almost 5,000 years ago, but later it entered another pharaoh's dream.
This has to do with a dream, right? This is what, Thutmose IV?
Well, this is Thutmose IV, and it describes his dream before he became king. So he came to have a rest in the shadow of the Sphinx. And when he rested there, the Sphinx, that was the god Horus of the horizon, came to him in his dream. And he actually spoke to him.
3,000 years after the Sphinx was built, the young prince, Thutmose IV, dreamt that the god Horus promised him the crown of Egypt if he cleared the sand around the statue. As pharaoh, Thutmose inscribed the dream's prophecy in stone. Much later, the dreams of another pharaoh provide a dramatic moment in Joseph's story.
There's a passage in the Bible I wanted to read to you. It's Genesis 41. It's lovely. It says, Pharaoh has this dream and he can't interpret it. And he says, so he sends for Joseph. And Joseph comes from the dungeon and it says, he had his hair cut and changed his clothes. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one else can interpret it. Will you interpret it for me? And Joseph, it's great here, he says, no, I'm not going to tell you. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare.
Yes.
In ancient Egypt, whoever did the dream interpretation, where did the power come from?
Well, the power came from God himself. However, God has got his own agents, and the agents in this time will be priests.
So even though at this point in the story, Joseph is imprisoned in Egypt and he's a very small man, it almost as if the story still has inherited all this Egyptian influence. So that when the Israelites were here, they picked up a lot.
Well, you have to remember that when the Israelites came to Egypt, they lived in Egyptian atmosphere, and they absorbed the Egyptian culture. So they were surrounded, so to speak, with the Egyptian culture, and they had to deal with it. And later on, of course, they themselves became Egyptianized.
Then it came to pass that Pharaoh had a dream. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. He slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads blighted by the east wind sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads.
The Pharaoh brings Joseph out of prison to interpret his dreams. Joseph declares that the dreams portend 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph recommends that the Pharaoh preserve food from the time of abundance for use during the time of famine. The Pharaoh is so impressed by Joseph's plan that he places him in charge of his entire court.
In Genesis 12, Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, just a lone man and his family. Now, less than 3 generations later, his great-grandson Joseph becomes second in command of the greatest empire on earth. And the Bible, which earlier is interested in herding and wandering, suddenly becomes interested in the details of royal power.
Joseph's title was Vizier, or Prime Minister, a role that is memorialized on the walls of royal tombs. Egyptologist Dr. Yasser Izzat gave me a guided tour in the Valley of the Kings.
This is one of the most beautiful tombs in this area.
So these are all the images of the...
Yes. As you see, and everywhere here they showed the title of the vizier. You see the blue circle up.
The circle with the dots in it.
Yeah, above it, you see the sign above it?
You know, what is that sign?
Yeah, this is Emira, means the overseer of the city.
Now, there's something I want to read you. In the Bible, in the story of Joseph in Genesis 41, it says, "See, I put you in charge of all the land of Egypt," the Pharaoh says to Joseph. And then it says, "And removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand, and he had him dressed in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck." Now, does that sound like what actually happened here?
Yes.
So it's almost like you can draw a direct connection between these hieroglyphs on the wall and what's in this book.
Yeah, that's right.
As the famine Joseph predicted spreads beyond Egypt, many foreigners are drawn to the country and its food reserves, including Joseph's family. his 11 brothers, and eventually his father, Jacob. Jacob has a new name, Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. His descendants will be known as the Israelites.
I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have.
And Joseph's family of some 70 members settle in the richest land of Egypt, Goshen, in the fertile delta area near the mouth of the Nile. The Israelites live, prosper, and multiply in Egypt for more than 4 centuries. It seems they have found a true home. I came to the Delta to explore what their lives might have been like at this time. Archaeological evidence doesn't reveal specifics about the Israelites' time in Egypt. The culture, laws, and rituals of what would become known as Judaism, such as observance of the Sabbath, holidays, and keeping kosher, would all be created after they left Egypt. It seems clear, however, that some elements of the Israelites' religion were influenced by their centuries-long stay in Egypt. The idea of the tabernacle and the structure of their later temple, for example, but most especially their emphasis on storytelling. Not only the size of the Egyptian temples impressed the worshippers who came here. Carved onto the very walls are virtual textbooks of their ancient religion, telling the story of the gods and their power over the land. Today, 5,000 years after this process started, the monuments of Egypt are a testament to the importance given to these stories and the huge impact they must have had on the Egyptian people. The walls aren't merely sprinkled with writing, they are covered with it.
The reason is, these monuments were built in the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, when writing was just being invented. The Egyptians pioneered the idea of using words and stories to build a national identity.
The Bible may be the beginning of Western religion, but it's also the culmination of a profoundly Near Eastern sense of how to build a people through storytelling. Egyptians in particular were interested in the components that make for good yarns: sex, revenge, power, despair, and reconciliation. Stories that every level of Egyptian society could relate to.
And it seems impossible not to conclude that when the Israelites came into Egypt and came into contact with all this writing, that their own storytelling improved as well.
The story of Joseph in the Bible also includes a reference to one of Egypt's most well-known practices of the dead. In order for a dead person's soul to enter the afterlife, it needed a body. This inspired the most famous preservation technique in history, mummification. The Bible says that Joseph's father, Jacob, was himself mummified.
Mostly all Egyptians.
So I went to talk with one of Egypt's leading authorities on mummification, Dr. Salima Akrim.
Let me read you a quote here from the last chapter of Genesis. Then Joseph ordered the physicians in his service to embalm his father. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. What's going on here?
So basically Jacob's being mummified. Embalming actually takes, the whole making of a mummy takes 70 days, but 40 days are used for the actual preservation of the body, when all the liquids are pulled out of the body and the body becomes sort of a stiff board, but well preserved.
And the fact that the text says in particular 40 days, that rings true to you.
Yeah. One thing that's very interesting about mummification is this 40-day thing, because I think in many of the cultures in the Near East, and many of the religions, you wind up having 40 days associated with mourning. After the body had been completely desiccated, it had to be wrapped, and that basically took another 30 days, bringing the total to 70. And then the wrapping would start. And so as you wrap the bandages, spells are recited, and sometimes the bandages themselves are inscribed with spells, because what you're doing is creating a physical barrier as well as a metaphysical barrier against evil demons and so on that might come and attack.
So the first person embalmed in the story is Joseph's father, and then Joseph himself is embalmed, but they're not pharaohs. I mean, are people other than pharaohs embalmed?
Absolutely. For anyone who is of high rank, and we do have tombs that have been found relatively intact belonging to architects or nobles, they would be buried with not just, funerary ornaments and several coffins and a sarcophagus, but their chariots, chairs, food, oils, unguents, pillows, jewelry, the clothes they wore in daily life, if they, beds, all kinds of things.
The Bible seems to be paying honor to Egypt and saying, we want to pay tribute to your culture by saying that we're like you.
Egypt was regarded as a very sort of chic culture in the ancient world. The Greeks learned from Egypt. They came to Alexandria. They flocked here because they thought the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians was worthwhile.
So today, even though Judaism came after this, and Christianity and Islam, which had this different belief system, still fundamentally, those of us today can make this human connection with the ancient Egyptians.
Certainly, because it's really the same kind of thing. I think no matter what your religious background, there's always this yen people have to try and extend their lifespan or to continue it after their death in some way, shape, or form. It gives them hope.
In ancient Egypt, ships assisted the spirit in its passage to the afterlife. Near the end of his life, just before Joseph is mummified and goes on his own final journey, he gathers his brothers together and he says, I'm about to die. God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Joseph, with these words, seems to predict the Exodus. He seems to know that an unfriendly Pharaoh will push down the Israelites, and God will lift them up and take them to the Promised Land. At the end of his life, Joseph is more than an interpreter of dreams. He's a prophet. My journey now led me to the greatest symbols of ancient Egypt, the pyramids of Giza outside Cairo. I hope to confront one of the more persistent legends of biblical history. Did the Israelites build the pyramids? Pyramids were burial chambers designed so a pharaoh's soul could ascend closer to the sun god. But their massive size served a more earthly purpose, to remind the pharaoh's subjects of his awesome power. The Bible never mentions the pyramids, but ever since the Middle Ages, as Westerners tried to decipher their meaning,
They became a symbol of the Israelites' oppression. Yet if you look at the Bible's basic chronology, the idea of the Israelites building these monuments is an impossibility.
I've been doing the math. If Abraham was born around 2000, that puts Joseph here in 1700 and the Israelites in 1300. This pyramid was built in 2600 BCE. That's 1500 years. That's as far as from us to the Byzantine Empire. We didn't build Constantinople. The Israelites didn't build the pyramids.
Whoever built them, it must have been dangerous. Trying to climb one is so hazardous, the government closed them to the public after dozens of people died trying to scale them. We had to get special permission, and truth be told, I was scared to death.
Thank you. So how high is this?
143 meters.
Wow, that's over 400 feet.
Yeah.
Now this is flat. Whoops.
Yeah.
And why is that one?
Limestone. 148 meters, this pyramid.
So someone took the top off of this one.
Yeah, probably 3 meters in height in the fact.
Oh, this is 3 meters high. Now, which way is Cairo?
This way.
So can you see the Nile from here?
Yeah, look over this way. All sides here.
In one way, the Bible and the pyramids have a lot in common. They're both this great monument of antiquity, but in a crucial way, they're also different. Because Egyptian religion did not survive, and biblical religion did. Why? Because in their journey, the Israelites took the best of Mesopotamian culture, the best of Egyptian culture, and introduced the notion of an abstract, universal God. With limited new ideas, and faced with greater powers to the north and east, ancient Egypt would eventually collapse. In the Bible, one pharaoh also feared a potentially powerful enemy within.
Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us. Therefore they set taskmasters over them, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses.
To understand this part of the story, I went to the Cairo train station to catch a ride to where the ancient cities of Pithom and Ramses were located. Once, these cities had been bustling centers of international commerce, which would have explained the large gathering there of immigrant labor, including, perhaps, the Israelites. On the train, I re-teamed with Professor Gabala to explore the Delta area where the Israelites may have worked for the Pharaoh on his massive construction projects. I asked him if Ramses II would have used foreigners to help him build his cities.
Well, he didn't need to, because outsiders were already in Egypt. Because at that time, foreigners came to Egypt either as prisoners of war, or even were sold in slavery from Syria, Palestine. And most of them will have settled in the Eastern Delta, and that's where his capital was.
So when we read in the opening chapters of Exodus about the Israelites living in Goshen, building the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, they are part of this network of foreigners who are helping in these construction efforts.
Well, that's true. And in the heart of the land of Goshen, Wadi Tumalat, you find Pi-Ramses, the capital of the Ramessides.
We headed first toward the ancient city of Pithom. Less than 50 miles northeast of Cairo, and mostly quiet today, Goshen had once been a thriving area of agriculture and commerce.
So this is Ramses II?
Yeah, that's another one of his statues.
So how many statues were carved of him in his life?
Oh, hundreds.
Ramses II was a master builder. He built the great temple at Abu Simbel, enlarged the temples at Karnak and Luxor, and wasn't above carving his own name over those of earlier pharaohs.
The stones were brought here from the other city.
They brought all the stones from the ancient capital, they brought it here. That would be the main entrance to the main temple.
We entered the gates, which would have had huge wooden doors covered with bronze. Even in ruins, the architect's genius, the sophisticated planning, and the skilled work of the laborers who actually built this city was clearly evident.
So this is one long narrative here.
Inscription here that shows that he is the king of the lord of the two lands, and that's one of his titles.
So this is Ramses'
Yes,
title.
yes. Wesir, Ma'at, Ra, Setip, and Ra.
Ra being the sun.
The sun god here and there. So he's the chosen one of the god Ra.
So if this is his name, then this is his picture.
That's his picture there, and he's giving offerings to the creator god Atum. And again, you can see his cartouches there. The title that we saw before, and his actual name, Ramses.
Many scholars consider Ramses II to be the pharaoh of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. He's usually cast as the cruel king in films like The Ten Commandments. His son, Merenptah, is also a likely candidate. The earliest reference to Israel in the ancient Near East comes from an inscription by Merenptah.
Can they still get more than one crop a year here?
Well, they always did. The delta is different from Upper Egypt.
Would there have been more trees here in the past, or this has pretty much always been the same?
I think and in ancient Egypt, this would have been mostly marshland, actually.
In this green field, there was little left of the great city of Pi-Ramses. Farmers raised pigeons here, where once there stood monuments to kings.
In Upper Egypt, these temples are huge. They're still standing. You can see all the ruins. How come there's nothing here?
Because things are different in Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, there you find the temples are in the desert. And that's why you don't even have stone here. The stone had to be important. For instance, the stone, this is limestone. It would have come from the vicinity of Cairo. That's about 100 kilometers to the south of here.
If they weren't made from stone, then what were they made with?
Mud brick.
So when we read in the opening chapters of Exodus that the Israelites were in Pithom and Ramses, building the store cities with mud bricks,
it would have been here.
In the very place where the Israelites are said to have toiled under an oppressive pharaoh, the mud bricks once used in ancient Egyptian cities are still made in the same time-honored way. The ruins of this ancient village for laborers offer clues as to how the Israelites might have lived while working for the pharaoh more than 3,000 years ago.
These houses were made from a mixture of stone and mud?
Mud brick, yeah.
All mud brick?
All mud brick, yeah.
Now tell me about one of these houses here.
This is the way to the house. And this is the entrance saloon for the house here.
So is this covered or this is inside?
No, it's covered, yeah. And this here, the kitchen. Another room here.
Okay, what
Yeah,
happens
there's
here?
2 rooms here.
Mhm.
One room for the children and one room for the man and his wife.
There's one more room back here.
Yeah, this is the end of the house here.
All the things you're not using, you put them away like the closet.
Yeah, closet, yeah.
Most scholars agree that although the Israelites were forced to labor under harsh conditions, they had homes and were not destitute.
Later, when the Israelites leave Egypt and go into the desert, they also think back fondly on their time here as one of abundance and good food. It's something we can all relate to. While you're in the middle of something, you may complain about it, but later you wax nostalgic for it.
Somewhere here in the seemingly timeless landscape of Egypt's delta marshes, a new chapter in the Bible begins. The story of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt.
The book of Genesis has four major characters: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as well as Adam and Eve and Noah. One character dominates the next four books, Exodus through Deuteronomy. He, of course, is Moses. He's by far the central character in the Hebrew Bible, yet he's one of the most human heroes ever created.
Among the reeds and shallow waters, the story opens with a mother desperate to save her newborn son. The Pharaoh is fearful that the Israelites are becoming too numerous, and orders that all newborn Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile. One mother defies the Pharaoh and gives her child the chance to live.
When she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off, to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and he became her son.
She takes the boy home and names him Moses. The word seems to come from the Egyptian word to be born of, and is the same root used in the Pharaoh Tutmosis and Ramses. Either way, the Bible here takes a step closer to the heart of Egypt. Joseph is second in command to the Pharaoh. Moses is raised in the Pharaoh's house.
Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren, and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. So he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of the Pharaoh.
Moses eventually arrives in the land of Midian, an ancient territory believed to be in what is now southern Jordan. In Midian, Moses finds a wife and works as a shepherd. Then, one day, God, unannounced, speaks to Moses from inside a burning bush. God asks Moses to liberate the enslaved and suffering Israelites from Egypt and deliver them to the Promised Land. For these Bedouin tribesmen, the burning bush is one of their oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation.
God didn't speak inside the bush. He used the burning bush to attract Moses to this place so he could speak to him.
And when Moses heard that voice, was he scared?
Yes, he was. But God told him not to be afraid. He told him that, I'm your God, and you are my messenger, so hear what I have to say. God ordered him to go to the Pharaoh and tell him about this faith. He then went to Egypt and decided on a day to see who's stronger, God or the Pharaoh.
The stage is now set for an epic showdown. Moses versus the Pharaoh. A reluctant representative of God would confront the most powerful man on earth, the ruler of the entire Egyptian empire.
Now Moses, who at the burning bush tells God that he stutters and is afraid to speak, rises and goes to the palace, and the Bible says, early in the morning, stands before the Pharaoh and utters one of the most famous lines in the Bible, "Let my people go."
The Pharaoh dismisses the plea of Moses and increases the suffering and torment of the Israelites. he orders them to work twice as hard. God then initiates a series of signs and wonders, designed to persuade the Pharaoh to set the Israelites free. He turns the waters of Egypt to blood and follows with even more plagues. There was a swarm of locusts, a rain of frogs, a lashing of hail, and an outbreak of disease, before darkness is made to cover the land. The Pharaoh refuses to back down, and God sends Moses to deliver an unimaginable threat. So Moses makes one final trip to the palace and issues his most chilling threat. "Thus says the Lord," declares Moses, "at midnight every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and a loud cry shall be heard in all the land of Egypt." Still, the Pharaoh will not let the Israelites go. God instructs Moses to have the Israelites mark their homes with the blood of a sacrificial lamb.
Now the blood shall be a sign for you on your houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations.
Ever since antiquity, people have tried to figure out a naturalistic explanation for the plagues. One theory held that a comet passed too close to Earth, and another theory held that this volcano went off in the Mediterranean and filled the sky with dust. But this one ecologist did this study, which I think is really interesting. She said that there was a huge flood down in Ethiopia, which sent an abnormally high amount of water up into the Nile, and that caused a lot of algae in the water, and the algae killed the fish and the frogs, and then the frogs crawled up on the earth and attracted anthrax. That's not anthrax. Do I have anthrax? Well, the anthrax killed these cows, and the smell then attracted the flies. And I think the 8th plague is the locust. This is the locust, and I can't remember what caused that. This is interesting, but I do think it begs the question about the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn son. What caused that? Finding a scientific explanation for the plagues is appealing. If we can prove that one detail of the story is true, surely the entire book is true. But I think these theories actually undermine the Bible. The plagues can be explained by natural phenomena. Where does that leave God? I think I, like a lot of people, enjoy these theories because it's a lot easier to think about them than to think about the central character in the entire book. The Bible reveals exactly what caused the 10 plagues. God caused them. And if we're going to develop a relationship with that God the story suggests, we have to break away from our surroundings and set off for something new.
We set out to follow the path of the Israelites, heading east toward the Sinai. With the Exodus underway, the Pharaoh changes his mind about letting the Israelites leave. He sets off with his army in hot pursuit. The Israelites soon arrive at a body of water and get trapped. They need a miracle to cross the water. But which body of water was it?
There are 5 possible bodies of water the Israelites might have crossed. You've got the Mediterranean, the marshy area just south of there, Timsah, the Bitter Lakes, or the Red Sea itself. Now, the biblical term for this body of water in Hebrew is Yam Suf. Yam Suf doesn't mean Red Sea. It actually means Sea of Reeds. Red Sea is a mistranslation that first was introduced in the Greek a couple hundred years before Jesus, from there into Latin, and then into English through the King James Bible in 1611. The reed in question is papyrus, and papyrus is a freshwater reed. That would seem to rule out the Mediterranean marsh and the Red Sea, leaving Timsah and the Bitter Lakes. I'm sort of fond of Timsah because it's this shallow lake, and you can imagine on a windy day the Israelites wading across and the chariots coming and getting stuck in the mud.
When I arrived at Lake Timsah, it suddenly hit me. I had been so excited about which body of water the Israelites crossed that I had missed the larger meaning of the story. The Exodus marks a fateful turning point in the life of the Israelites.
At this point, the Israelites are trapped. They have this huge body of water on one side and 600 Egyptian chariots closing in on them from the delta. The people go rushing to Moses and they say, "Was it for lack of graves in Egypt that you brought us out into the wilderness to die?" And Moses has this great line. He says, "Hold your peace. Don't worry. Be patient. God will deliver you."
Being here, I could sense the fear and apprehension they must have felt when they faced this tremendous obstacle. I decided to cross the water myself.
How are you?
Yes.
Can we go across?
Yes.
So what do you fish for?
Moses, Bori, Bolti, Tuba.
Do you have some Moses fish? What does it look like? Can I see it? So what is it? It's a kind of, looks almost like a kind of flounder. So why is it called Moses fish?
When the sea was split in half, it split the fish into two sides. One white, one black.
Thousands of years after the event would have taken place, the story of Moses miraculously parting the waters of the sea is still alive.
The Israelites go marching through the sea on dry ground, a wall of water on their right and another on their left. The Egyptians, meanwhile, come barreling in after them.
And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters returned, and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel went on dry land, in the midst of the sea. So the Lord saved Israel that day, out of the hand of the Egyptians.
In dividing the waters, in destroying the Egyptians, God shows his mastery not only over nature, but also over humanity. I had come all this way, to be on this lake, only to realize that it wasn't the location, or even the event that was important. What was important was that the Israelites experienced their liberation as an act of God.
I always thought of the Exodus as a moment of exhilaration, out of slavery into freedom. And sitting out in this water, I can't help thinking that while the Israelites might have been excited, they must also have been deeply afraid, because they were leaving the most civilized place on earth for the most barren, based only on the word of a God they'd never actually seen. Perhaps no one since Abraham, 800 years earlier, could understand that degree of faith. Because on the other side of this body of water, on the other side of the Sea of Reeds, is the desert and the great unknown.
The quest to reach the Promised Land had just begun. Walking the Bible continues with Moses' epic 40-year journey through the barren wasteland of the Sinai Desert. It's a tale of survival, of a people's redemption, and above all, the story of how this vast desert proved to be a crucible of faith and the birthplace of a nation of God. It's the next chapter in the greatest story ever told.
Walking the Bible is available on video cassette or DVD. The companion book to the program is also available. To order, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.